Welcome to my demo of copying a drawing by master artist Juliette Aristides. This drawing is called Isabelle, and I found it in Juliette Aristides' book, Lessons in Classical Drawing. This is a beautiful book full of great lessons and inspirational drawings. The first thing I did was take a picture of this drawing and printed it out slightly bigger than it is in the book in black and white. To go over the steps that help us understand how to draw a picture, it might be helpful to use tracing paper first to understand our steps. The first thing I do is draw a notional box. This is the box that my drawing will fit inside of. Once I have my notional box, I want to give myself a directional line that helps me locate my subject in space. I mark the top and the bottom of my drawing with a small horizontal line. And I start marking in some bony landmarks to help me understand the position of the body. These lines are from shoulder to shoulder, bottom of rib cage on both sides, and hips on both sides. Then I draw in a gesture line that helps me understand the basic gesture that this model is positioned in. These are all just preliminary studies to help me simplify what I'm looking at. My next step is to understand the block-in. The block-in consists of looking for the greatest masses of my subject and blocking them in with straight lines. Often I will do several versions of block-ins, starting with very large shapes and then whittling down to smaller and smaller details, sort of like carving away the clay of a sculpture. Drawing in straight lines helps us get away from worrying about the accuracy of curves and small nuances around our subject. We are just concerned about understanding the position and angles of larger shapes. Once I have the outline done, I also block in the shadows. Since shadows tend to transition softly, this requires making a determination with a straight line of what I consider to be in shadow and what I consider to be in light. For my next quick study, I want to create volumes in my model. And one way to easily see what is going on is to imagine the three major masses of the body, starting with the torso, then the pelvis, and then the head, and imagining which planes face shadow and which planes face light. Imagining these three masses as cubes really helps simplify all the complexities of the human form. You don't have to do any of these exercises on trace paper. Many artists just start all of these straight on their drawing paper. But for the purposes of helping people get comfortable with all these approaches and studies, I find that the tracing paper makes it very approachable. Once drawn on tracing paper, it's much easier for me to then retrace my steps on my blank drawing paper without tracing. Eventually you'll find you don't need to use tracing paper at all. But I say use this approach if you find that it helps you. And I will do one more tracing paper exercise to better understand my subject. Each one of these takes less than 5 minutes. It's well worth to invest your time to understand your subject before diving in for your final drawing. Once again, I am choosing to block in the form. I'm taking into consideration everything I've learned so far about my figure. My block-in is a little bit more sophisticated than the first one I did. I'm looking at negative spaces and still drawing pretty much in straight lines. I'm thinking about the volume of the rib cage and the pelvis and the head as I draw my block-in this time. As I map the areas of light and dark, this time around I will even add a little bit of shading to them. Again, this is just a study, so I'm not looking for the nuances of shading. These studies are a lot of fun to do. You don't have to do all of them for every drawing, but I find that they are so quick and really help me understand what I'm looking at. I have found that by doing them on tracing paper first, students start to really understand all the different approaches we have for studying our subjects. Once you're comfortable with the concept of these different studies, feel free to skip doing these on tracing paper and do your studies directly on your drawing paper by placing your reference image right next to your drawing paper instead of tracing. So here are all my studies: the gesture study, the general block-in, the volumes, and a block-in with some shading and emphasis on the volumes. Now I'm ready to start my drawing. I put my reference image right next to my paper, and I start with my notional box. Oftentimes the notional box is a box that really hits all four sides of your subject, but I chose that my notional box will be the entire image. I'm using my ruler to get straight lines around my notional box, but I'm using a little knitting needle to measure the height and the width of my box to make sure that my drawing is exactly the same size as my reference image. I don't like using a ruler for these measurements, as it becomes a ruler exercise instead of an exercise in observation when I do that. Many artists will use a skewer or a knitting needle or even a string to get accurate measurements. Here I'm just double checking my height and my width of my box. It might seem like I'm spending a lot of time on something as pointless as the box, but if my box is not proportional and not accurate, it will throw the size of my figure off as well. I determine where the bottom line is for the bottom of my subject and draw it in. With my ruler, I also place my directional line of where my subject is placed within this box. I'm measuring from that vertical line to the edge of my notional box, and I sketch it in. This is roughly the position that my subject should be drawn in. Now I'm measuring the height of my actual subject. I've marked the top and the bottom lightly, and I give myself the gesture line that I studied earlier. I'm paying attention to where that gesture line is in relationship to my vertical directional line I put in at the start of the drawing. Now I want to do my block in, and I block in right on top of my reference picture. You can see this is a much more general block in than what I did on my trace paper. I try to do my first general block in with 7 straight lines or less. I think of my notional box as a big block of clay, and this first block in is my first carving out of clay. Once I get this block in accurately, I'm ready to start carving away into more details. At this point, I'm almost ignoring my subject and really just looking at my lines on the reference picture for the block in. I'm assessing how long and what angle the lines should be at. Here I'm using the skewer to go across from my reference picture all the way over to my drawing to make sure that things are aligning horizontally. The degree of accuracy you expect to get out of your drawings is directly proportional to how much time you'll spend on them. Not every drawing has to become a 5-hour or 10-hour or 30-hour study. If you want it to be quicker and you're happier at a phase that isn't as detailed, that's fine, that's up to you. But I encourage you to spend quite a bit of time trying to get your drawing accurate. All the hardest work of drawing is done at these upfront stages. I continue to use my knitting needle to measure angles and proportions and make sure that my block in is more or less accurate. Once I'm happy with lines, I go over them with a little more commitment and make them slightly darker. I keep working my way around the block in until I'm happy with what I have. At this stage, I'm ready to carve away a little bit more of this clay, so to speak. I'm using the negative shapes behind her head, around her neck, and across her shoulder to continue with my block in. Here I'm looking at the negative shape that's created between her arm and her back. At this stage, the drawing is still quite loose, and it should be. As a general rule, always draw from big shapes and loose strokes to smaller and smaller shapes and tighter strokes. I turn my attention to figuring out the block-in of light and dark areas. This mapping in helps me further break down the larger shapes into smaller shapes, still in broad strokes, not looking at details. As I map in the lights and darks, it really helps me start to understand the orientation of the planes of the biggest masses. Which planes are facing the front? Which planes are facing the back? What is facing light? What is facing dark? In order to not get lost in all the nuances and gradations of darkness, I really squint at my reference photo. This helps eliminate a lot of the middle tones, and it's easier to identify just a dark and a light line. I don't want to be concerned about nuances at this early of a stage. Having done most of these steps with my tracing paper earlier, I find this really relaxing and easy to work my way through. You can see me starting to define the planes of the head here in a very general geometric way. I add a light, flat tone to any of the dark areas. Again, squinting to try to imitate the biggest shapes I see for the dark areas helps with this part of the drawing. As you build up your drawing, you'll find that a lot of your initial construction lines get absorbed into the drawing. But at this stage, I'm also ready to start erasing some of the construction lines that I no longer need, such as the larger block-in lines. I even erased my notional box. I use a soft craft brush to remove all the eraser debris and minimize how much I'm smudging. Now I'm ready to commit to the outlines. I'm starting to soften the edges of my block-in. And here I am starting to look for more nuanced curves and details. I'm softening up all the straight lines of my block-in and paying careful attention to look at my reference picture. As I soften my edges, she starts to come more into view. This is a small eraser that I have called the Mono Precision Eraser. It allows me to erase small little marks. I work my way around both the contour of the body and the maps of light and dark. I'm still not drilling down to the smallest details, but I am softening up my block end. I'll work my way around the whole block end several times this way, softening and getting more accurate as I go along. I also start committing to some of my mapped in lights and darks. Now I'm ready to start looking at more of the internal shapes, of the more nuanced shapes of light and dark, examining angles, sizes, relationship to each other of all these various shapes. Without getting overly detailed, I start to put small marks for where her features will go. Again, these are somewhat general. For a likeness, it's important to really capture the shapes of the shadows and the light. So I hold off on detailing features and I really start focusing on the shape of those shadows across her face. And also the shapes of the shadows in her hair. I start to build up the dark areas as well. I build up this graphite in layers, so I have more control over how dark ultimately I want it to get. As you can see, I use my eraser often, and I use it as a pencil. It's not just for correcting mistakes, but also for helping to redefine shapes, and also to lighten up certain lines. You'll often see me holding my pencil and my eraser in my hand at the same time. I'm using my pencil to lighten up some of my block in and also to lighten up some of the construction lines. As I build up volume, it's easy to lose some of the shapes I originally drew. My graphite pencil might start to grow around them and make them bigger than they were originally. So I keep going back and forth between my drawing and my reference picture to make sure that my proportions are staying accurate. It's easy to use my eraser to carve things back down if I find that I'm enlarging some of the shapes I drew earlier. As my drawing grows, I keep checking for accuracy. Sometimes something seems accurate until a later part of the drawing when I start to realize it really isn't. Every line you put down helps you relate and read the previous lines better. Don't be afraid to erase lines that you committed to earlier. The whole thing is a work in progress. I never consider one area completely done until the whole drawing is completely done. Before that time, anything can change. Here I'm using my blender tool, sometimes referred to as a paper stump, to soften some of my values. You don't need to use a paper stump. Some people prefer to use a tissue folded, which I also will do on occasion. Some people use their fingertip. I'm not a fan of that since the oils in our fingers can really darken up some of the graphite. This is a piece of tissue I have, and I'm just softening up the values I've put in. The drawing is far enough along that it's time to really start looking at details. I'm using my eraser to be more accurate with some of the drawing I've already done. I'm thinning up her arm, I thinned up the back of her neck, and then I go back to using my pencil. I'm looking at more nuanced differences in the shading now than I was earlier. I'm looking for the actual shapes of shadows and the slight difference between the darkest darks and the neighboring darks that are not quite as black. I also want to soften the transition between the darkest side and the lightest side. I can use a blender for that or lightly use my pencil to create a light bridge of graphite between the darks and the lights. I'm using my kneaded eraser to softly lift up some graphite in some areas that I want to be slightly lighter. Not every drawing you do has to be absolutely detailed out and accurate and require hours and hours of your time. It's up to you to decide at which point you want to call your drawing finished. I find that for me, that is different with every drawing I do. Some I even stop after the block-in stage. I feel like that has satisfied what I needed to learn from that specific exercise. With this drawing, I feel like I'm getting close to the end. I start cleaning up all around her edges, any smudges around the paper, and I'm using a hard white eraser for this. For the smaller areas, I used my mono eraser. The original drawing has the highlights done in white, and I decided to do the same. My tone paper is lighter than the paper Juliette used, so my white pencil does not show up as dramatically as hers does. I hope you've enjoyed this demo. Thanks for watching.